Morning, friends. The folk who are smiling are Lions supporters. Our reading for today comes from Matthew. It's going to be up on the screen, and I'm going to just read 4 verses from verse 9 to verse 13. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. And while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. We thank God so much for those words. And we ask God to speak to us today through those words as we look at them together as a congregation. We begin today a series entitled Living Beyond Loneliness. And I have a hunch that as soon as we mention that theme, we can see its relevance for our lives and for our times. Loneliness is all around about us. It's in the cities, it's in the suburbs, it's in our homes, it's in our hotels, it's in the university residences, it's in the hostels. Loneliness is no respecter of people. It affects those who've got money. It affects those who don't have money. It affects those who are married and those who are single. It affects those who are old and those who are young. It affects every one of us. I think sometimes we make a mistake when we confuse aloneness and loneliness. Sometimes we think the only lonely people are single people who live on their own, and nothing could be further from the truth. Sometimes someone who is single and lives on their own is far less lonely than someone who lives in a family. Loneliness is that deep, painful ache in the human heart for connection. In every human heart. And it comes into our lives in many different ways. Have you noticed that? There's the loneliness of being a leader. When you lead in an organization or a business or a company and you know the buck stops with you, there can be a loneliness about that. During December, I read the autobiography of Alex Ferguson. You may not know who he is, but he was the manager for Manchester United, one of the best soccer teams, they say, in the world. And I was reading his autobiography, and there's a chapter which really struck me. Here was this man, a leader amongst men, And he speaks of how in the afternoon he would sit in his office after the training, and he would just long for someone to knock on his door and say, "Hi, Alex." It's almost as if people left him alone because he was the leader, and no one knocked on his door in the afternoon. And he just speaks of the isolation of leadership. The loneliness of being successful. Have you noticed that the more successful you become, the more suspicious you become? You don't know whether people want to be friends with you because of what they can get from you, or whether they want to be friends with you because they really enjoy your company. You don't know. It's tricky. I think of the loneliness of some of the celebrities. You know, sometimes I go to a concert and you watch the guy or the woman up front, and the person says to 5,000 or 20,000 people, "I love you." And I want to say, "You lie. You don't even know me." But it's like sometimes it's almost the celebrity, the ache for connection. And have you noticed how many celebrities have taken their own life over this past year? Deep loneliness. The loneliness of depression, of despair, that, people can't see your depression. It's not like a broken arm or a broken leg. And just the loneliness sometimes of waking up each day and it's just very, very dark. The loneliness of guilt. When you've done something and you've betrayed your deepest values and you can't speak about it to anyone. And sometimes we are as sick as our secrets, and we carry our guilt and our shame around, just praying that no one will ever find out. And the loneliness of that, the loneliness of sin, the loneliness of being a young mother. And you're stuck all day and you're with your little child, and your husband goes off to work earlier and comes back later. It's interesting is when the children are young, he always has to go to work earlier or come back later. Just the loneliness of that. The loneliness of loss when you lose someone that you love. Through divorce, through a relationship breakup, or maybe through death. I was sitting with John the other day, recovering alcoholic, 73 years of age. I buried his wife a few months ago, and he just said to me at the Mug and Bean, "Trevor, there is nothing more lonely than losing the person you've spent your life with." Are we connecting? Do you know what I'm talking about? And it's against this backdrop, this real backdrop, that we explore today, particularly the journey from loneliness to community. And to help us do that, I want to look at Matthew's story, because it's interesting. Did you notice how it started? It starts with him sitting alone. He's a tax gatherer. He works for SARS in Jesus' day. And there was no one more lonely than the tax gatherer. No one more lonely. Except, I think, most probably the leper. But tax gatherers were lonely. They were isolated. They were seen as sellouts. They were not allowed in places of worship. Lonely. But that's not how the story ends. It begins like that. And it ends with Matthew, did you notice, sitting around the table with Jesus and some other friends. And you can almost just imagine the laughter and the eating and the conversation and the jokes. And somehow Matthew has gone on a journey from loneliness to community. And what I want us to do just for a few moments, I want us to zoom in on that story together as a congregation. And I want us to let God speak to us deeply, deeply today. Will you notice a few things with me? And I'm going to take you to the text, and I will take you through this text verse by verse, and I want you to watch it. I want you to notice that Matthew begins to live beyond loneliness. He goes on a journey from loneliness to community when he experiences for himself God's radical acceptance and unconditional love. Look with me again. Look with me again at verse 9 in that story. As Jesus went on from there, he saw, I love that word saw. He saw Matthew. When you are lonely, you feel invisible. Speaking to a lady the other day, she said, so-and-so walked right past me as though I was invisible. Jesus never walks past us as though we are invisible. Jesus sees us. And he sees Matthew, and he says to Matthew, what does he say to Matthew? Matthew, follow me. Can you imagine how Matthew feels in that moment when Jesus says to him, Matthew, follow me? In that moment, he feels accepted and loved and recognized. And because he would have seen Jesus as representing God, as a prophet from God, a teacher from God, in that moment, Matthew experiences God's acceptance and love. And that's where the journey out of loneliness always begins. When we experience God's recognition of our life, when we experience God's acceptance and God's deep love. Friends, there is a hole in every one of our lives. I like to call it the God-shaped hole. And it's only a hole that God can fill. Nothing else can fill that hole. Nothing. And we will always ultimately be lonely until that hole is filled. And we try to fill it with so many things. And those things make us even more lonelier. We go from one crazy sexual encounter to another. We spend our lives just racing around, buying more things that we don't need. We find ourselves getting addicted to hurry, to busyness. And it doesn't fill the hole. And it's in this deep loneliness that Christ comes to us, like he came to Matthew and says to us, follow me, and as you follow me, as you build your life around me, Jesus says, I will lead you into the heart of God. I will lead you into a deep experience of God's love and acceptance, and you will never be lonely again. Because you will know that you are in God's heart. Paul said there's nothing that can ever separate me from God's love in Jesus Christ. Nothing. That's an experience we can have. But will you notice something else with me? Will you notice that Matthew's journey out of loneliness towards community, will you notice that it happens when he opens his home and his life to Jesus' friends? Look at verse 10. Look at verse 10, and it moves on from verse 9. Just look at what happens while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house. Matthew's opened his home, opened his life. Many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. Matthew now is sitting around a table. He's gone from the loneliness of the tax sticks to the community of a table. You know, when we open our life up to Jesus, he always brings his family with him. Always brings his family with him, his friends. He never comes alone. And I want you to notice two things about Jesus' friends. Will you notice that they're not perfect? Tax gatherers and sinners. They're not perfect. They're not perfect. You know, sometimes people get disappointed in the church. Have you met people, they say, the church is just a bunch of hypocrites. I want to say, friends, today that the church is not a museum for saints. It's a hospital for recovering sinners. It's a hospital for recovering sinners. And I'm so glad, because it means there's a place for me. If you're looking for the perfect church, don't join it, you'll spoil it. Jesus brings people into our life, and they are as broken and messed up as we are, but he brings them to us and us to them. And will you also notice that they're very different to us? When Matthew became a disciple, he found himself with other disciples, and they were different to him. And when Jesus brings us his friends, they're different to us. Brings Lions supporters, Bulls supporters. They're different. They're different. Friends, will you open your life up to Jesus' community? Find a way over these next few weeks of doing that. That's what brings life into our loneliness. This last Wednesday, Debbie, the woman I'm married to, myself, we opened our home again. We do this every year for 12 months. We opened our home again to 12 30-year-olds. And we're going to travel now for 12 months with these 12 folk. And it was we came together, it was our first time. And as I sat in our lounge with these 12 30-year-olds, this was the first time they'd all met each other. We had nothing in common except Jesus. And as we shared a little bit of our story, and I just sensed this is God at work, just helping us to go on this journey from loneliness to community. That's the journey Jesus takes us on, always. But I want to say one more thing about Matthew's story. Matthew lives beyond loneliness. He moves from loneliness to community. Does this make sense? Please think this one through carefully with me, because he discovers a new story for his life. A new story. God's story. He's been living the story of a tax gatherer. He's been living an existence self-centered, self-absorbed, self-focused. It's been all about Matthew. Now Jesus comes to him and says, Matthew, follow me. And Matthew moves into God's story. And God's story is totally different to Matthew's story. You know, we long to be part of a big story, don't we? We long to be part of something bigger than our own little life. I think that's why we watch soapies so much. You know, somehow, we need a bigger story, Or we become fanatical sports supporters. You know, I go to Loftus and you sit on the stand there, and everyone in blue and horns and you know, it's like we belong, we're part of a story. We want to be part of something bigger than ourselves, than our own little life. And Jesus comes to us and says, follow me, and I will lead you into God's story for your life, and you will know that you belong. And God's story is totally different to our little story. God's story is where people matter, other people. God's story is where I don't always want to be understood, but I try to understand. God's story is where I don't always want to be loved, but where I learn to love. God's story is where I don't always want others to console me, but where I learn to console others. God's story is where I take whatever I do during the day. I'm a doctor, a lawyer, an IT consultant, a nurse, a teacher, a lecturer, a psychologist. I take what I do during the week, and it's not only a means for my own life, it is that, but it's more than that. And I use whatever I do during the week as part of God's story. And when I become part of God's story, I know I belong. Let me end. I don't know what's happening in your life at the moment. But all I know is this: Christ is God's response to our loneliness. I've almost got a hunch that if Jesus were to come to Johannesburg today, if Jesus were to walk down the aisles of Mosaic, he would say something like this today: "Come to me, you who are lonely, and I will give you the gift of community. Come to me." And he comes to you today and to me today in my loneliness and in all the struggles of my life. And he says to me exactly what he said to Matthew: "Follow me, follow me." And as I learn to follow Jesus, he leads me into God's heart. He leads me into a new community of recovering sinners. And he leads me into a new story. He leads me into God's story. And in that story, I am never, never alone. And so I invite you today to hear the call of Jesus and to respond. Let's pray. God, you recognize each one of us. You see us. You see us. We are visible to you. And you love us so deeply that you come to us in Jesus Christ. And in Christ you call us to yourself. Lord, will you begin to give us a new faith, a new trust, a new confidence today in Jesus. And may we allow Jesus to lead us into your heart, to lead us into community, to lead us into your story for this world. This is our prayer. And we offer it to you with all the love and the longing of our hearts in Jesus' name. And we say together as God's people, Amen. Amen. May the joy of Christ and the community of the Spirit be with you. God bless you, friends. Take care.